What if we wanted to customize our generators even further? Previously, it didn't spit out a Coffeescript template. Well, I've gone ahead and done a little bit of work ahead of time to show you how we could customize that. Inside application.rb, you'll notice I've commented out a couple of directives here. The style sheet engine, because that's what the generator would use, would be SCSS. I've also commented out this assets false line here, which would disable both JavaScript and style sheets. So what that's going to do is it's going to look inside both those repositories for templates or template generators that have to correspond with either style sheets or JavaScript. So I've gone ahead and pulled up my version of CoffeeRels on GitHub, and you'll notice the file path here, CoffeeRels lib rels generators coffee assets, following that same decorator pattern that we've talked about in the past. So if we go back into code, all I had to do is I copied over the actual generator itself in case I wanted to customize it later, and then underneath templates, I've added another folder for coffee assets for javascript.coffee, which corresponds to, here's the asset generator, and underneath templates, you have javascript.coffee. So the main problem I had was that A, it wasn't generating CoffeeScript for that resource for companies, and B, how would I get it to know the proper names of attributes to put into that file? I've copied this over from the one that we generated for companies and then added some interpolations. We still have access to things like table name.pluralize. Now in this case, it was a little bit more difficult to figure out how to get the attributes, but doing some digging around on the console, I was able to figure out how it gets the names of the attributes that it's going to pass into the template. So let's try it out. We're going to generate our next model, which is role. Role has a name and it has a key, and it belongs to a company. You'll see now that we've done invoke assets for coffee and invoke assets for SCSS, but SCSS did nothing. This is the file that the CoffeeScript template generated for us for roles.coffee. Looking at the output that it generated, we now have roles index table, which is what we wanted. We also have the names of the keys that it put in there. So it's not quite right. It's missing created at and updated at, but it did have actions. So I'm going to open up javascript.coffee. So a little trick you can do with the scaffold generators, if you don't want the output that they created or you want to start over and try again, you can use a command called git clean-fd. So first I'm going to say git checkout config routes. That has now rolled back the changes that were made to routes from the generator. We're left with a bunch of files from the generator that we don't want. We can nuke them all by saying git clean-fd. Having run the generator now, after our changes, we should be able to go back into roles.coffee. We now have our JavaScript ready to integrate seamlessly into. One of the previous issues we encountered was that when it generated the index JSON JBuilder file, it had duplicate attributes for name, one with a link and one with just the attribute name. The JSON template renders out the partial for the thing that it creates. So if we go to the partial itself, we notice that the same issue is still occurring. We have duplicate keys for name, and we don't have created at or updated at, and it's not putting it in the proper location, which would be under roles/actions. So in this case, because it's underneath rels, we're going to go to lib generators rels templates partial.json.jbuilder. So this is the file that generates the partial. We can see one thing is that we need to do the plural table name, which would be roles/actions. We can also add the missing timestamps here by replacing it with singular table name. Okay, after a little tinkering, I've actually learned something new. If you have this dash here at the end of your interpolation, it doesn't create a new line in the file that it outputs. Also, attributes are actually plain old Ruby objects. They're not just a list of symbols. So I had to say if attribute.name.toS is equal to name, then do the link for it, otherwise do what you would normally do. So now, with the adjustments in the syntax, everything's now lined up properly, how it should be. We have a link to name, and we have the created at and updated at timestamps, and we also have it looking at the proper partial. Okay, now that that's done, I'm going to go to the roles migration, and as you can tell right here, I've added an index on a key on the roles table because that's how Jack will look up roles for a company. So let's go ahead and migrate the development and test databases. As we did previously, we'll go to the model for role, and we'll go to the spec for role, and add the necessary validations there. So I've gone ahead and added the standard specs that I will need for role, as well as I've run the specs, and you can tell currently that they are not passing, as we expect. So the scaffold template gives us the standard expected to have a valid factory. We also want a role to be scoped to a company, so it has to require the company, and it has to require a unique name for the role, regardless of the case sensitivity, scoped to the company. So two companies could have the same role name, but the same company cannot have two roles with the same name, regardless of case sensitivity. So let's go ahead and get the code that we need. So we're going to say validate name, uniqueness, case sensitive, false, and then this is the key part here, is that this validation is scoped to company ID. Then we also require the company to be present. I've also updated the factory to make sure that a company gets created along with the role. This is another neat trick to prevent having to create a bunch of records when you don't need them. So this is the user factory that I created earlier, and it's going to be associated to a company. I did that off screen. So when it creates a user record, it's going to automatically fulfill the association for a company. So we'll do that same thing in role. So now you can tell that the only specs which are failing have to do with the roles controller. That's because we want roles to be scoped to a company, and the default scaffold doesn't know that it has to load it through that company model. And it's also not passing in a company to the factory for it to create it through. So let's go ahead and adjust that. If we go to roles controller, we want to say before action load company. This is going to happen on everything. So what we're going to do with this controller is it's actually going to be a nested resource underneath companies. Typically what you would do is you would have a helper method like current company, and it would automatically do this. But since we're just doing this for an example purpose, we're just going to nest it under the structure of /companies sub company ID /roles sub ID. So let's go ahead and update the routes file to reflect that. I've added a to-do note here as well to say that we can only edit users under a specified company. If we run the task to generate the routes from rels, we'll see the pattern that's going to emerge, as I spoke of earlier, where all the routes for roles are going to be nested underneath a company. So that means that this before action that we have set up previously has to load a company record. And we're going to say add company equals company.find params sub company ID. That will get us the outer resource. I'm also going to update the notes for these actions so that it's clear that when you look at this file, that all these actions are nested underneath a company route. Now that we have the company loaded, we need to scope or limit the roles which come back to be underneath the company. So we're going to say at company.roles, we're going to nest it underneath the company. So it's going to be at company.roles.ordered. For new, we're going to say at company.roles.new. For create, we're going to say at company.roles.new, passing in save params. And underneath the save params method, we're going to remove company ID because that will automatically be set through the association. So what we're going to do in the controller spec is we're going to say a stub for a company. The current user is going to belong to that company. And then when we build out a factory for role, we're going to say merge company ID to the ID of this company scaffold here. What we can see now is that not only are the controller specs for role failing, but the routing specs for role is also failing. So let's do the easy one and fix the role routing spec. That's easy enough to do. We're going to update this URL local variable to say /company/5, and then everywhere that there is a closing parenthesis, we're going to make a cursor. We're going to search for that closing parenthesis and insert company ID of 5. So what it's saying here now with URL is that the route it's going to do is going to be dummy.test/companies/5, then /roles. So it matches the pattern that we have. So let's go back to the specs, and it should only be the controller specs that are failing now. So now, what's going on with the controller specs? Okay, so there were a couple issues that I'll show you. First of which, if we go back to the roles controller, because we nested the routes for roles underneath company, when we redirect after creating or updating a role, we need to update the routes to match that. So this is shorthand syntax for the URL generation to say company role. When you delete a role, you also need to go back to the index for company roles. The next reason it wasn't working was because we're loading the roles to the company, and we hadn't added that association to a company to say you have many roles. The next issue is when you have a nested route and you're doing a controller spec, you have to pass in the company ID as a parameter to the route generation, as well as update references to redirect to URLs. Now if we run the entire suite again, we'll see that all of the specs are passing. With the specs now passing, we should be able to go in and update the navigation so that we can see the list of roles in the interface. We should now be able to go and click on a company, and I've added a little bit of UI for a sidebar so that now we can go to roles. Oh, now we get an exception because all of the URLs which were generated for Slim reference the old routes. So let's go update those. Now that all the views are updated with correct routing information and path information for link generation, I've gone ahead and created a couple of companies with one role each. This is to make sure that each role is going to the company that it's supposed to go to. So if I click on Phoenix Fire Development, I should only have the role called Test, which I do. And clicking on Test shows me that indeed it belongs to Phoenix Fire Development. If I go back to Blackwing Development and click on the inactive company and click on Roles, I'll notice that Test 2 does indeed only belong to Blackwing Development. So everything is scoped properly. The other thing you'll notice on the company index is that our ordered scope is indeed working because Blackwing Development is alphabetically before Phoenix Fire Development. Okay, and with roles being done now, I think we'll call that good for today. Tomorrow we will scaffold out a new resource, lead, which will represent a lead in a CRM system. It will belong to a company, it will be scoped to a company, and it will be assigned polymorphically to a user. That will set us up for Jack, wherein we'll be able to define dynamic permissions based on that association. Thanks for watching.